I would first like to acknowledge that the University of the Fraser Valley is situated in the traditional territory of the Stolo peoples, who have occupied the land long before Canada was formed. Today we will be discussing three books written by Indigenous authors, the first one being The Secret Pocket, the second one being The Girl Who Loved the Birds, and the third one being Blue Kamas, Blue Kamas. Each of these books were chosen as they were written by local Indigenous authors and were meant for the same age category, which was children's literature. These books share the importance of preserving Indigenous traditional knowledge and all convey themes of resilience and embracing Indigenous heritage. I will start off by talking about the hardships and perseverance experienced by Indigenous children attending residential schools in the Secret Pocket, written by local author Peggy Janicki with illustrations done by Caroline Victor. Peggy Janicki is a local author from the Nakate Watane First Nations and resides in Chilliwack. The Secret Pocket is based off her mother's story of attending the Lee Jack Residential School, located on the south side of Fraser Lake in British Columbia. It depicts Janicki's mother's resilience and her perseverance through the various hardships she experienced during school, highlighting the importance of the connection Indigenous children have with their community and how traditional knowledge can help them survive residential school. I chose to feature Peggy Janicki's book as it provides insight on the painful journey Indigenous children experienced while attending residential schools. I like how this is a personal story, coming from Peggy's own mother, which helps exemplify the many hardships these children faced and how they used their traditional knowledge to survive these harsh conditions. I also really like the illustrations done in this book and the use of color. Being in and around residential schools is very painful and traumatic, so the illustrator decided to use a mix of dull and dark colors to represent these saddening moments. Moreover, light and fun colors were used to represent happy moments when the main character spends time with her grandparents and learns more about her Indigenous history and traditional knowledge. In 1831, the first church-based residential school opened. For the next 165 years that followed, over 150,000 Indigenous children would be subjected to attending residential schools. The Indian Act was put into place by the Canadian government, which made it mandatory for all Indigenous children between the ages of 7 and 15 to attend these residential schools. If family were unwilling to give their children, they would face severe punishments, which included jail time. This was done in an effort to sanitize Indigenous children of their culture and erase their traditional knowledge. In some ways, the Canadian government succeeded in doing just that, as a lot of traditional knowledge and Indigenous teachings weren't passed down to succeeding generations. Instead, these teachings were actively oppressed during a child's time in a residential school, where nuns forced Indigenous children to assimilate and conform to European ideologies. Although residential schools were marketed as a place of good education, these schools differed greatly from public schools and were underfunded, which meant that there was a lack of resources to supply the children with. This included having inadequate bedding, not enough food, unsanitary conditions, and overcrowding. The Secret Pocket presents the heavy topic of residential schools in an approachable manner that is geared towards a younger audience. The Secret Pocket shares two kinds of stories. One being a trauma story demonstrating the hardships Indigenous children faced in residential schools, and the second one being a transformation story of how children were able to apply their traditional knowledge learned from their elders in order to overcome obstacles, which then healed them in the process. These children were subjected to harsh conditions that no child should ever endure. Some of the awful conditions mentioned in the book were, I cried because my stomach hurt from not having enough food. Betsy taught me how to eat toothpaste so the pain would go away. And, all of us were hungry and cold all the time. This scene of a residential school is depicted in a dark shade of color to represent the hardships experienced by all Indigenous children attending these schools. The choice of black and gray color is symbolic of sorrow, loss, and oppression. The somber tones also emphasize the haunting presence of the school itself, which was a place associated with pain and cultural erasure. The scene really highlighted their forced separation from their family, culture, and language, all of which were forbidden while on school grounds. In order for the children to survive these schools, they used traditional knowledge that was passed down from generation to generation. The main character, Mary, discovered that she could sneak food out of the kitchen, which would keep them sustained and prevent their stomachs from hurting throughout the day. However, there was just one big problem. How exactly were they going to store this extra food? I mean, if they got caught with it, they would for sure get a strict beating by one of the nuns. So the solution had to be something sneaky and out of sight. That's when Mary had a great idea, to sew secret pockets into their petticoats to hide the food. This demonstrates how Indigenous children often relied on traditional knowledge they learned while at home to survive the harsh conditions of residential schools. I previously mentioned how this story was also a transformation story, where children were able to apply their traditional knowledge learned from their elders in order to overcome obstacles, which then healed them in the process. In the book, Mary mentioned that it was easy work because my ulu, aunties, and utu were master sewers, beaters, and kigswood makers. They had taught us. This is important because it shows the importance of the pass down of traditional knowledge and how it is used to overcome obstacles. Despite the harsh conditions and multiple attempts to erase their indigenous culture, children, like Mary, found ways to adapt and persevere by applying what they had learned from their communities. The image on the bottom left-hand corner shows the importance and significance of the pass down of indigenous traditional knowledge. As a young child, Mary was taught to sew by her grandmother. We can now see that Mary uses this sewing knowledge to survive the hardships of residential schools, as these secret pockets now provide a hiding place to store extra food so the girls don't starve to death. As I bring my discussion to a close, I want to reflect on the three main topics introduced to the reader in the story. The first is that children had to embrace their indigenous heritage in times even when they were told not to. This proved vital for survival as they used their traditional knowledge of sewing to ensure they didn't starve. The quote, "We sewed our survival into every stitch," really emphasized the resilience these children had and how they found strength and survival through cultural practices that were taught at home. The second point was that indigenous traditional knowledge and sacred practices should be preserved so future generations can benefit from this wisdom, with a quote from the main character reading, "We were geniuses, we are geniuses, we will always be geniuses." This tells the audience that traditional knowledge is sacred and should continue to be passed down to future generations so they too can learn from their ancestors and what they had embraced and preserved despite many hardships stemming from colonization. The third and final point was something I found unique. The secret pocket is gifted to Indigenous graduates at UFE. This helps in the sharing of hardships every child faced while attending residential schools, and the importance of reconciliation by larger institutions, such as the University of the Fraser Valley. I also wanted to point out that the bright coloring of this image is symbolic of when Mary spent time learning traditional knowledge and her culture at home with her Utsien and Utsu. It's definitely a stark contrast to the dark tone used to represent the residential schools.
The next book that we are going to discuss is The Girl Who Loved the Birds. It's written by Joseph Dendurant and illustrated by Eleanor Atkins. The reason why I chose this book is, after watching My Legacy in this class, I developed a deep desire to explore Dendurant's literary works. His inspiring journey of self-discovery and recovery from years of hardship and addiction left a profound impact on me. Furthermore, his dedication to giving back to his community and preserving their cultural legacy through storytelling, engaging both children and adults, has deepened my admiration for him as an individual. He is a member of the Kwantlen First Nation and the director of the Kwantlen Cultural Center. He believes that he has always pulled out characters from the stories that he and his friends have heard from their elders. The illustrator of the book is Eleanor Atkins, whose traditional name is Mimakote, and it means the first bird to sing in the morning. She is a member of the Kwantlen First Nation and an Ingwakope artist. Her works draw from the traditional teachings of the coastal and interior Salish culture and a deep connection to the land and water. She creates in different mediums including illustration, painting, printmaking, wood carving, and public art installation. She illustrated The Girl Who Loved the Birds and A Magical Sturgeon. The latter was longlisted for the 2023 First Nations Communities Read Award. She shared in an interview that she took inspiration from the people within her community for this particular book. The cedar rose on the girl's chest is inspired by one of her Kwantlen elders. Her trade bead necklace is an ode to her own cousin, Ethina Pika, who is also a talented Coast Salish artist. And the cedar headband that the girl wears in the story is inspired by a family from the Katsi First Nations. The book delves into the themes of kinship and humanity's profound connection with nature. The gouache illustrations used by Atkins are vibrant, colorful, and very engaging for children aged 4 to 8 years. The sun in the first picture symbolizes the creation, while the moon in the second one represents truth and intuition. The story follows a young Kwantlen girl who forms a deep bond with the birds on her island. She collects materials for their nests, shares meals with them, and nurtures their well-being. In return, the birds show her kindness, creating a reciprocal relationship of care and respect. The symbolism of the moss growing in the forest, paralleling the girl's journey of aging, artfully conveys the inevitable continuity of life and the natural cycle of growth. The Quantin girl goes into the cedar forest to gather moss. As the moss grows, so does she. A beautiful quote from the book. Another captivating aspect of the narrative is the portrayal of the girl's tender care for the birds from a young age, providing them with sticks to build their nests. In turn, the birds care for her as she grows old, ultimately embracing her under their wings when she transitions to the next realm, symbolically granting her the wings to join them in the flight. The old Quantin woman looks up to the sky as every bird takes flight, and soon she too begins to rise up. As the song comes to an end, she too opens her wings forever. What a beautiful ending.
Blue Camas by Danielle S. Marcoux and illustrated by Alyssa Koski. This work was included in our presentation because it highlights the work of award-winning Indigenous illustrator Alyssa Koski of the Kainai, or Blood Tribe of the Blackfoot in Alberta. Indigenous art within Indigenous children's literature should be discussed because just like oral story and tradition, imagery plays a significant role to shape a reader's perspective. It can be argued that Indigenous art within Indigenous children's literature is its own language, in the sense that it speaks to us and helps bring the reader into the story and into the hearts of the characters and message. Illustrations within children's literature can show emotion, beauty, and sometimes more than words themselves on the page. A child can understand pictures, even if they do not fully grasp the words or content. Another reason this book was selected was because the author's cultural location is in BC, and the themes and main subject of discussion is found within the Coast Salish body of traditional knowledge. Although Marcoux is not of Indigenous descent herself, she explains how settlers are responsible for disrupting Indigenous cultural practice, destroying their ecosystem, harming their livelihood, and costing them their lives in the process of colonization. She touches on these difficult topics in a way that is suitable for a child from ages 6 to 8. Sinoquila Weiss of the Squamish Nation is an ethnobiologist that points out, in colonial narratives, we are often told that Indigenous people did not have any idea about agricultural practices prior to contact with Europeans. In fact, settlers did not understand the practices of sustainability and loving care that go into our harvesting methods. This book helps transform the biased colonial narrative of Indigenous food practices. I'm happy to share this book with my children. This story illustrates and describes the beauty and importance of the camas flower to the Coast Salish of British Columbia. The characters include the local Indigenous people, settlers, local animals, and even a settler pig. There are birds, the song sparrow, orange-crowned warbler, crow, Steller's jay, cedar waxwing, and even a northern pygmy owl that comments in the background. They act as narrators as these creatures converse, think, and worry. In the background, context. Indigenous people depended on this plant for harvest. The wild camas cover a vast area, and the story describes how during harvest, the bulbs are dug up, carefully separated, where the big ones are taken for food, and the little ones are left to grow and produce for the next season. The story explains how these camas bulbs are roasted in a traditional underground pit, buried below the earth's surface. Their bulbs are shown to be an important part of the Coast Salish feast and highly coveted both as a treat for eating and as a commodity of barter for trade. The story. When a young Indigenous girl returns in the spring to harvest the blue camas, the rippling sea of flowers is gone. Few butterflies are left. She cannot access the one bulb of camas left, and a pig is eating it. She doesn't recognize this animal. Her people have been getting sick. The new people ripped her field of camas apart. The girl asked, "How could you survive this assault, my beautiful blue flowers?" The story describes loss in a profound way. The song sparrow, it feels the girl's loss and explains, "Oh, she is so sad. Her whole being aches. Let me sing my best sweet song to cheer her heart and fill it with hope." Key themes include death of her people, death of the blue camas, restriction to move and harvest on the land. The girl describes the meadow as having been once full of her ancestors. Her beloved people are no more. The fence prevents free movement on the land. She thinks it is strange, the eternal loss of centuries of her family's work. The owl worries for the girl. Will she ever taste her traditional food again? Will her people's laughter ever resound through this meadow again? The owl's worry passes all throughout the meadow and forests. The whole land sighs all at once. It is important to discuss the significance of the loss of this harvest. The blue camas were a food source for humans and animals, such as deer and burrowing animals. But they also contained inulin. Inulin is a dietary fiber, prebiotic, and contains a beneficial bacteria. The article Inulin, Properties and Health Benefits says that inulin is beneficial for regulating lipid metabolism, weight loss, lowering blood sugar, inhibiting the expression of inflammatory factors, reducing the risk of colon cancer, enhancing mineral absorption, improving constipation, and relieving depression. So this blue camas plant had significant benefits for health for Indigenous people. Cultural appropriation. Clark of Lewis and Clark wrote about the blue camas in detail in his journal in 1805. This was when settlers were settling the Pacific Northwest of what we know as the U.S. today. By the 1850s, it is reported by the U.S. Department of Agriculture that the blue camas were harvested by settlers for the purposes of export to Europe. So not only did settlers destroy the local indigenous plant, they also harvested them for the purposes of monetary gain. Biodiversity. This plant attracted millions of butterflies and pollinating bees in addition to sustaining the living beings that ate them. Due to the loss of these insects and pollinators, it is hard to quantify the extent of the damage that was caused by the loss of this plant.